Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. Welcome to the Nebraska History Museum and to the Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Brown bags have been offered since the mid-1980s. Lectures are held on the third Thursday in the auditorium here at the museum at 15th and P Street in Lincoln. You can find a detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Society's programs and services on the Society's website at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Among the benefits of membership are subscription to Nebraska History Magazine, use of a microfilm reader printer in the Society's library archives to make free copies from microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, reduced fees for kids' classes, tours, after-hours events, and similar activities where there is a fee, discounts in the Society's landmark stores here at the museum, at the state capitol, and at Chimney Rock. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs. We offer special appreciation to LNK TV, a service of Lincoln City government which produces these programs. The programs are broadcast by cable partners across the state and are posted on YouTube. The Society is so pleased to be sharing these programs with you. To find these videos on YouTube, it's easy. Type in your browser, www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Click on Playlists and you will go to a new page. There you will see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures, where you will find over 160 past brown bags available to you on YouTube. Our speaker today is Patrick Jones. Dr. Jones is an associate professor of history and ethnic studies at the University of Nebraska. He researches, writes, and teaches about modern U.S. history, race relations, and African-American studies. He is the author of The Selma of the North, Civil Rights Insurgency in Milwaukee, and In Their Own Image, Artifacts from the Great Plains Black History Museum. His topic is Freedom North, Uncovering the Civil Rights Movement in Omaha. Just to let you know about asking questions, Patrick says to ask them anytime. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Jones.
Good day. How's everybody doing today?
Good.
Good. I have a little bit of the winter voice here, so I'm going to use my water as we go. I first want to just thank everybody at the State Historical Society and here at the museum, John in particular as the organizer for this event and the whole series. It really is a great opportunity for me to share some of these great resources with you, and it's a great resource for our state, so I appreciate you being here today as well. And I want to thank the folks who are doing the technical part of it as well. It's my pleasure, my privilege to be here. I teach modern U.S. history and African-American studies at the university in both the Department of History and at the Institute for Ethnic Studies. And it is Black History Month, so we have that connection here. And as you may know from the media, we're also in the midst of our latest racial crisis on campus. So it's particularly important, these kinds of events, and for any opportunities that we can create to come together and to talk about issues related to our difficult, often tragic history of race, and think about in more complicated and deep ways how we might move forward from this place to something better too. So I really appreciate that you're here, and for everybody who will watch it out there in the world too. What I'm going to do today is share with you artifacts from the Great Plains Black History Museum in Omaha, a community-based museum that was going for a while from the mid-1970s to the 1990s and then was closed for a number of years, and then over the last few years has gotten back on its feet. I worked with the museum a few years ago to help bring their archives back together. It had kind of gotten scattered about, and helped them put the archive back together, and produced a book out of that too. That's an artifact-based book. Several hundred images are in the book, and maybe about 80 pages of text. If you're interested in that, you can contact the Great Plains Black History Museum, and they can get you one of those. I'd also encourage you to consider becoming a member. It's a really important community historical institution. One of the few repositories of African American history in our state, but also regionally as well. And as I mentioned, they're kind of in the process of continuing to get back on their feet and things like that. So it's a nice opportunity to support a community institution if you're interested in that. So I'm not going to give you really a kind of scholarly talk. I rather would like to share with you as many artifacts as I can and talk to you about some of the different aspects that they reveal about the civil rights movement in Omaha, our largest city and the home of the vast majority of African Americans in the state. When we think about the civil rights movement in a popular way, a lot of people think immediately and sometimes almost exclusively about the American South. My own work as a scholar, I was born in Baltimore and grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for graduate school to get my PhD. And when I was a grad student, most of the historical work was on the Southern movement, but I knew that there was a there in terms of Northern struggles for racial justice because of where I had grown up. And so my work is attempting to push the geographic boundaries of how we think about the civil rights era and Black Power era, and to stretch that beyond the South, and to think about the stories related to the Black Freedom Movement, the modern Black Freedom Movement, outside of Dixie or the Deep South. I think that's particularly important. Particularly for our time now. Not only does it reveal a hidden history that's critically important, but it really reveals a history that I think importantly connects to our enduring challenges with race and urban inequality today. These stories and this history can help us think about how we got to where we're at and why we still have these persistent problems today. So I think it's a really usable past as well, and critically important. I think that's also why we don't confront this history very often as well, because it compels a reckoning with ongoing inequalities in a different kind of way. But all the more reason for us to do that today in the United States, as we're in several years into the Black Lives Matter movement and a national and local racial crisis. So let me just say, these materials come from the collection of the Great Plains Black History Museum, which was founded and brought together by a community member in Omaha who also participated in the civil rights movement, Bertha Calloway. It was a homespun kind of grassroots endeavor. And it focused on African Americans in the Great Plains more broadly, but the emphasis of the collection is on Black people in Nebraska, and particularly in Omaha, where the vast majority of African Americans are located. African Americans in Omaha were a small set of the population until the 20th century. There were African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century, but in small numbers. And like many large and mid-sized Midwestern and Northeastern cities, the African American community really began to grow in size as a part of the Great Migration of the World War I era and the 1920s, and then later with World War II and the post-war period. And this is where we really get a sizable African American community. And like most other mid-sized and large American cities where African Americans had moved to during this period of the Great Migration, they had hoped to find something better than they were leaving behind in the Jim Crow South, but They didn't find the promised land that they had hoped for, but instead they found just a new system of white supremacy and racial inequality and discrimination. And so African Americans who came to Omaha, whether it was through the railroad or stockyards or other job opportunities, what they found was a system of segregation that worked a little bit differently than in the South, but many of the results were similar. So they found pervasive housing discrimination, which led to segregation, African Americans living almost exclusively, ultimately in North Omaha, what we call North Omaha now. Still today, the large majority of African Americans live in North Omaha. So pervasive housing discrimination. Within that circumscribed community, housing conditions deteriorated over time, and so we go from kind of ghettoization to slumification in many areas of that community. We see pervasive employment discrimination, which leads to high rates of unemployment and impoverishment. We see school discrimination and inequality and segregation as well. We see a form of social segregation, while there was not by law segregation in a place like Omaha. There were a variety of places and spaces where black people were simply not welcome. Restaurants, hotels, entertainment venues, etc. And you came to learn that very quickly if you attempted to go to one of those places. And that could play out in terms of slow service, it could an insult, direct racism, etc. But you quickly got to know the lay of the land in terms of race in a city like Omaha. In addition, African Americans did not find themselves represented significantly in formal politics, in civic boards and other institutions that played important roles in setting down both kind of the rules of play in the city, but also dishing out resources and opportunity in the city as well. So we have a broad system of inequality that African Americans find themselves in. And like black people around the country, they're not satisfied with that situation. And from the very beginnings, African Americans are asserting themselves, pressing outward against this system, attempting to define their experience and their existence in a place like Omaha for themselves, to challenge these mechanisms of inequality and discrimination, and to make change within the community and with allies as well. The white power structure used formal mechanisms, legal mechanisms, institutional power, economic power, and when all else failed, violence. There's a long history of violence. We're coming up on the anniversary of the 1919 lynching of Will Brown in Omaha. There are a number of instances of racial violence throughout the history, and one site of that often happened was in terms of clashes between police and the community as well. So a long history of tension between the police force and the African American community that lingers and continues to today as well. So African Americans, like African Americans throughout the country, by the post-World War II period are beginning to mobilize what we'd call the civil rights movement. And while that has a particular shape and significance in the South, it's also taking place in the urban north in cities like Omaha. But this struggle does have deep roots, so I just wanted to show you a couple of things that predate this kind of modern civil rights era. And so here's one of the earliest NAACP membership cards in Omaha, dating back to 1919. So black people are forming organizations to articulate and to represent their own interests and to press for change. This is a flyer, a kind of a fold-out piece that's from the national NAACP, and it's the first annual report from the NAACP. And while this is not a document that was made in Omaha, somebody in Omaha had this, right, which tells us something else, which is that people in Omaha were not isolated. So black people in Omaha, as they were across the country, are aware of the rest of the country. They're aware of what's happening in other places. They're learning from it. They're in network and connectivity through organizations like the NAACP through the mass media, through moving around and traveling, through kin networks, family networks, and things like that, church organizations, etc. The NAACP will continue to be a central organization all the way through contemporary times, and certainly the modern civil rights era as well. But we can see in the kind of early post-war period too. So here's a convention kit, the National NAACP Conference, Oklahoma City. And so Omaha is sending delegations of people like the Urban League does to other cities for regional and national conventions to talk and to listen, to strategize about how to make change. You know, these are very moderate kinds of efforts for change. Work through existing structures, work through the legal system, work through bureaucratic mechanisms like a group like the NAACP, which has local chapters and state branches and a national office. It's a group that's dominated by the middle class. It's an interracial group as well. They issue a lot of reports, so you'll see a lot of kind of data-y stuff. So we'll collect information about Black experience and data, and we'll put it out in a report. And in this way, we can popularize and expand people's understanding and knowledge of what Black experience is like, where exactly inequality is at, and this will be fodder for legal action, political action, legislative action, etc. So this is a particular kind of strategy and approach to racial change. This is an early picture from the same period, the 1950s or so, of the NAACP branch. So you get a sense here, too, of the kind of dignified protest, too. Notice what they're wearing. Again, this is a kind of middle-class and professionally based organization. There is a youth council chapter, too. So there's an adult branch, and then there's a youth council as well. So young people increasingly get involved in. I have a document we'll get to later that shows the tension around that too. Increasingly, as we get into the 1960s, adult branches of the NAACP were pretty moderate. The NAACP often was uncomfortable with direct action and protest politics. Young people were often out ahead of the adults in their community. But until the mid-1960s, youth councils and youth branches of the NAACP were under the control of the adult branch. They weren't distinct and separate. And that became a source of great conflict. And so youth chapters from around the country lobby from within the organization and ultimately are successful in the mid-1960s in creating a new structure within the NAACP that breaks off youth councils from adult branches, which then gives youth councils much more leeway and freedom from the oversight and control of adults who often wanted to put the stop on protest politics and that kind of thing. So we see youth councils getting more involved in that kind of thing. Another early and interesting story, you may know something about, if you know anything about the musical history of Omaha, there's a rich jazz history. And one of the important parade bands, jazz bands from the early part of the century was headed by a guy named Dan Destoons. And he comes up from New Orleans. And the reason I've got him here, I like to do a lot with music, but he also has an important civil rights story that's hidden. How many know of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that establishes separate but equal? And Homer Plessy, who is a light-skinned African-American from New Orleans, his dad is involved with a citizens group that is trying to press against segregation and public accommodations there and transportation. And Homer Plessy is the test case. He goes on a train and gets arrested, and that becomes the test case that leads us to this important Supreme Court decision. But in fact, Dan Destoons, who comes to Omaha ultimately, he is a test case before Homer Plessy's test case from the same organization. But his case gets kind of passed out and thrown out on a technicality, so they need to try again. And ultimately, Homer Plessy is successful, and so we remember his name is on it. But buried underneath this significant regional musical history for Dan Destoons is this civil rights history too that most people don't know about. And so there's lots of stuff on his musical history in the collection. One of the other significant early organizations is the Urban League. The Urban League is started in the urban north as a result of the Great Migration, and it's an organization that's focused on African-American migrants, largely from the South, who are coming to cities like Omaha, and to help them transition into the new urban environment. Again, they're a moderate organization. They tend to work through negotiation with established power, whether it's political figures or local businesses, trying to open up the doors to increased employment of African Americans, to gain housing opportunities, to gain political access and things like that, as well as the immediate needs of migrants. Sometimes the Urban League early on could kind of have a moralistic tone towards migrants. They saw themselves as the kind of established black community. They often could echo some white sentiment towards new migrants who were said to be kind of problematic or less moral, or they're mainly working class folks. Again, the Urban League's got a lot of middle class folks, so that we can see some class tensions sometimes in both the NAACP and the Urban League. But again, like to issue a lot of reports, like to have a lot of meetings, like to have banquets to raise money and membership. So an organizational approach to civil rights. Here's the 1965 annual report. A lot of informational material. So here's a brochure about how to get a job from the Omaha Urban League. So giving pointers and tips, doing job training and things like that for African American community members. They had an old folks picnic every year. This is just one piece of one of these. I love these images from the 20s and 30s, these black and white panoramic pictures that are they're like this big. And so I couldn't digitize the whole thing for you here. Everybody would look super tiny. So I just took a little piece of it out here. But it celebrated the elders in the community, right? So uplift of the community, right? Pride in the community, institution building. Here's one of the Urban League annual meetings, right? So lots of folks participating. Again, you can see dressed very nicely. There was a women's auxiliary group. And so these are some of the women in the 1960s getting on an airplane. Here's a little bit later in the 70s, getting on a bus to go to the national convention to participate in the women's auxiliary part of the Urban League. So we also have, these kind of gendered dynamics where men tend to dominate the formal leadership, and women are put into a kind of specific gendered women's side group within the organization. But there was great, participation and pride. I'm not sure, that was probably in Oklahoma or somewhere, so they got hats or, their cowboy hats. The head of the Urban League in Omaha during a spell in the 1950s was a young man named Whitney Young. Whitney Young then goes on, he participates in a variety of activities related to civil rights and racial change in Omaha, and then he is significant because he goes on to be the head of the Urban League, the national office of the Urban League, and one of the most significant civil rights leaders of the 1960s through that job. So there's an important connectivity there with Omaha to the Urban League's national history and Whitney Young. So here he is later on as the head of the National Urban League. He's come back to Omaha to give a talk. So he maintained his connectivity to the city, et cetera. In addition, during this early post-war period, before we get to what we think about in the late 50s and 1960s and into the 70s as the civil rights era, there were other efforts at civil rights organizing, and a lot of this kind of stuff. So this is at Tech High, North Omaha High School. And so an interracial youth rally, right? Coming out of World War II, there's a lot of heightened idealistic rhetoric coming out of the Holocaust, et cetera. So there's talk in terms of and increasingly among liberals, political liberals, there's a sense that the great failing of American democracy is race relations, and everything else is pretty cool in American democracy, and the outlier is race. So if you're familiar with Gunnar Myrdal and An American Dilemma, he is a sociologist who's funded to write a study about race relations in America in the post-war moment, and it becomes a bestseller, and it really transforms a lot of white liberal thinking and this and growing recognition among white liberal political folks that something has to be done about race, that this is kind of the great failing of America, and that in this coming out of World War II, something's going to need to be done about it. So there's a lot of kind of interracial attempts in this moment of time. Again, we're having a rally here. This is not radical act. This is pretty moderate and, integrationist, interracial kinds of stuff happening. In addition, formal politics, while a limited avenue for African Americans, continues to be a significant one. This headline could have been from 2008. It's from 1952, but it's an article in the newspaper about the growing black political power in the Democratic Party and the decisiveness of the black vote. That was certainly the case in 2008 in the congressional district that encompasses Omaha when Barack Obama won. For the first time, we split our electoral vote, and the turnout among African Americans was significant and higher than normal. And we could have seen very similar headlines here. So mobilizing political participation has long been a dynamic of racial change as well. Now, the really first significant civil rights organization in Omaha comes about in this post-war period, and it's a really fascinating story. It's the DePores Club. The DePores Club starts in the late 1940s, in 1947-48. And it's an interracial group of students clustered around Creighton, but also local high school students. There's a white Catholic priest, Father John Marco, who's deeply involved and a central organizer and leader. He's had some significant experiences during World War I. He's a priest at Creighton, committed to kind of the universal principles of racial justice and interracialism. And so along with some students, one white student in particular, Denny Holland, becomes an important leader of the organization, both getting it together and then in the activism that they follow through with after they're organized. Father Marco wrote a kind of significant minor philosophical and theological piece that predates this about racial justice and the responsibility of religious-minded people to be involved with racial justice. And so again, we see in this post-World War II moment in time what would be described as kind of white liberals and African Americans, often younger African Americans, but not exclusively, coming together in kind of interracial, integrated ways to try to make good on the universal claims that America puts forth, but that it's not lived up to in its creed, etc. So here's the credo and pledge of the Omaha DePores Club on the screen. And the reason that I have it here is that if you were to look closely at the language, it talks about all members are of one human race. It really emphasizes these kind of universalistic values, right? Transcendent kind of values of a shared humanity here. We're coming at a moment in time, the same year that this comes out, the United Nations puts forth the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? And so there's a lot of mindfulness about what's happened with genocide during the Holocaust and a lot of attempts at growing ecumenical work and at kind of universalistic attempts at interracialism. And this is a really great example of that here as well. This is Father Marco as a young man and as an older man, too. But what's distinctive also about the DePores Club is that they're willing to engage in protest politics. They're not the same kind of bureaucratic institution like the NAACP. In fact, that's why there's the need for a DePores Club, is that a growing number of people feel like there's a need to take greater action, more urgent action, and to push levers of power and people in power and institutions of power if change is really going to happen. And so they engage in a variety of kinds of activities. They early on create a DePores Center that has, an inexpensive grocery store, is a community kind of space, has some services involved with it, has organizing space to talk about race relations and to organize out of as well. It's kind of a controversial thing at the time for the moment in time as well. But the need for an independent space, the group will ultimately be forced off of the Creighton campus, and they will connect with the Omaha Star and Mildred Brown, and she is notable for editing the African-American newspaper in Omaha and being not only one of the few and only African-American women to edit a newspaper, but one of the few women of any background to edit a newspaper in the United States. And she's going to give them space and then promote their work and participate in some of the activism that they do too. So we get some of this cross-connectivity. But the need for space, right? We can see this in the Southern movement with the use of churches and other spaces. Black landowners often put themselves at risk to allow civil rights activists the space to organize. So you need a place to get together and be able to freely talk about these things and organize for change. This is a picture of the DePores Club. And I'm just pointing out here 3 significant figures: Father Marco, Whitney Young on the other side, and Mildred Brown, kind of towering figures in the Omaha Black history. Importantly, in the early 1950s, 1951 to 1954, they engage in a bus boycott. This is before the Montgomery bus boycott, which has taken its place as a moment in our national narrative of the civil rights movement. But in Omaha, here you see members of the DePores Club passing out flyers. And the issue here was not segregated seating. It was that the bus company, the transit company, that served Council Bluffs and Omaha, would not hire black men to be drivers. And that was a good working class job. Many of these men had participated in World War II and then ultimately the Korean War, where they had driven trucks and fixed them and done things like that. And there was a tension between national service and then how black people were being treated at home as well. And so we get a few years of protest here, an effort to press for change. And there were bus protests in other cities as well. So it's important to see that things don't start with the Montgomery bus boycott, that there's a kind of percolating protest happening in a lot of different cities across the United States. And then we have to ask, why do some stories then take their place in the national narrative and others, like this one, fall out and are not remembered? I really like this piece here. So it's telling people, well, if you have to ride the bus, because a lot of African Americans don't have a car, they depend on public transportation to get to their job or not. Well, if you have to use the bus, you can participate by paying in pennies, the 18-cent fare. So you can kind of be a pain in the ass, essentially. Right? So pay with 18 pennies. That'll be an annoyance to the driver in terms of having to count them. And this will be a different kind of way to register that you're with us on this protest. There's a lot of paperwork around this. The DePores Club does work. They show that here on the bottom, they're talking about other locations, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, where the streetcar or bus companies do hire African Americans. So to point to other similar cities and say this isn't how it is, so it shouldn't be like this in Omaha. So making rhetorical appeals, in different kinds of ways. News releases. This is one of many news releases that they put out about the protest, trying to explain to the community what they're doing. Again, this is mild kind of protest, but it's controversial. Any kind of protest is controversial, and large numbers of white folks make it about the form of protest, not the issue at hand. We still have that problem, today when it comes to African Americans challenging, right? It becomes about the kneeling at football games and the form of the protest, not about the issue of police killings of innocent black men and et cetera, right? So it diverts to the form of protest. So there's a lot of explaining and things that is constantly being done. So lots of paperwork around this kind of thing in the collection. They also challenge school desegregation, or school segregation, and push for school desegregation. So this is a great flyer that shows that other cities, again, so comparing to like cities in our region, where every other place hires African Americans to teach in high schools except Omaha. Omaha school system does not hire and place African American teachers at the high school level, so only at the pre-high school level. And then when they do get placed in the elementary and middle school level, they're only placed in schools that are in the black community and dominated by black students. Right? So they're pointing that out here graphically and then showing this comparison, right? So the city leaders can't hide behind the fact that, well, it's done, this is how it's done everywhere. No, Omaha stands out from other places. And so here's another, this is the backside of that, and it shows then a map of Omaha then, where Omaha African-American teachers then are segregated to school when they can get placed, are only placed in schools that serve African-American constituents there. Again, aware of the national context too, so referencing Little Rock, right? No, this is Little Rock? No, this is Omaha where we have segregation and resistance to change. Yeah?
Yeah, did that bus boycott have a positive outcome, or how did it end up?
It ultimately does. They make a deal and they start to hire, but it takes a while. It takes. He asks if the boycott, the bus boycott, ever had success.
It was from 52 to 54, right?
51 to 54, yeah.
Okay, so when did the hiring start for African Americans?
In that mid 1950s, and like most businesses, it's a slow process when it comes to hiring. So you get a driver, or two, or three, right, or a worker at the business, or. So these are very small gains, kind of pioneering, glass-breaking kinds of gains, but it's not leading to mass numbers, right?
Okay, but did the boycott continue until the hiring began? Or did the boycott end before the hiring started?
It kind of gets a negotiated outcome, right? And then the protest, which is, ebbing and flowing. It's not a continuous thing every day for 4 years either, right? It's an ebbing and flowing kind of in terms of the protest. So ultimately there's a negotiated settlement on that. There's, again, people writing to the newspaper about the situation in the school system. The DePores Club keeps a log of segregation and desegregation moments in the school system over time. Data, there's all kinds of stuff that over the years that there are different kinds of ways they're trying to highlight the inequality of segregated public schools. I will just note that the Omaha school system, after a serious misfire a few months back with trying to hire a new head of the school system, just hired both the first woman as the head of the schools and the first African American in over 100 years of history there. So that's an important change too. The DePores Club had a kind of a community newsletter type thing. And this is a story, I don't mean for you to read it, I just want you to get a feel for how this looks. So it's somebody's typed this up and they've mimeographed it and passed it out. But this is a story about a Creighton student who came from a different state and a different community, and talks about an African-American student coming to Creighton and being so happy to be here and thinking that Omaha, Nebraska was this place of freedom that was different from where he came. And he goes in to try to get a haircut, and the barber is like, nope, what are you doing here? You're not welcome here, right? And it kind of his first experience with the Jim Crow North here in Omaha. And then this one here, this halfway down that first column is an article about the spiritual equality of black and white people. So making a different kind of argument and trying to appeal to white Christians and Catholics, which are the largest group of white Christians in Omaha, that black and white people are spiritual equals. And then from there's a moral argument, right? There's a moral responsibility then to act on that equality. There's a lot of work around voter registration and political participation. Here's a cool poster from the collection about voting rights, registering to vote and using your voting rights and trying to mobilize political participation. The DePores Club kind of transitions into another group called the 4CL, which stands for Citizen Civic Committee for Civil Liberties. They become the main civil rights group for the bulk of the 1960s. It's a African-American oriented group. Ministers are in the lead of it, but a number of other people participate. They challenge popular ice cream place in Omaha, Reed's Ice Cream, that has stands around town, and they don't hire African Americans, and so nor do they hire them to drive their trucks, and so they press and get the first African Americans hired. And like the question before about when do they stop and what happens, they get one person hired in one of these stands, and then the protest stops, or that part of it, right? So get a sense of the limited results here. Here they are passing out leaflets and organizing, and the sign here is really great because it says Negro GIs drive trucks and tanks in Korea, but Negroes can't work at Reed's, right? So this rhetorical thing. Black men have participated in the military. They've done their service for the nation, but when they come home, they're not granted basic rights. And then using that argument against the nation. It's a compelling one. It's a powerful one for many who have served and who feel kind of nationalistic, patriotic kind of tones about things. They also lead an effort to desegregate the pool at Peony Park, which is now the food store that I go to in Omaha, a Hy-Vee food store. But they had a venue for music and outdoor stuff and a public pool. And now you can see in this poster, they would bring black acts, prominent soul and R&B acts and things like that. But when it came to using the public pool, it was segregated. And so young people associated with the DePores Club and 4CL get involved in a protest that ultimately leads to the desegregation of the pool there. And so we're now seeing, right, we were at the NAACP, here's the Youth Council, right, but they're engaging in protest politics, right, sitting in, picketing, things like that. So we're seeing a shift overall in strategy and tactics among African Americans and their allies for making change. There are still efforts like this around urban renewal, right? How do we deal with areas of the city that are blighted? Those areas are disproportionately populated by people of color in a space like North Omaha or South Omaha as time goes on. And there are efforts at urban renewal. And these are critical of urban renewal. There's criticism of urban renewal from white folks who don't want to help and don't want their tax monies to go to help to areas of the community that they think are black areas of the community. There's criticism from communities of color who see these, we would use the language of gentrification or something like that, Negro removal programs that are just going to push out African Americans from these communities and not make a new space for them. So they're contentious efforts, and there's a lot of politicking around this. This is a much more kind of policy-driven, resource-driven, bureaucratic struggle rather than your traditional kind of protest politics. Sometimes protest will happen, but when we look at the urban north, we have to see not just traditional marching and demonstrating, but other stuff that's happening around politics and getting a fair share of the pie and things. Here's the 4CL protesting again and highlighting where they've gotten jobs. It's Safeway, Hinky Dinky, Gordon Market, Shavers Market, right? So again, applying some protest, publicly shaming an organization by highlighting that they don't hire, and then normally the group would relent and start to hire slowly African Americans. This, you don't need to read this, but this is the letter there was a voter rights drive the NAACP did, and the Youth Council spearheaded it. And then after they did and organized a lot of new voters, then they started to hear from other African Americans in the community that elders in the adult branch were being critical, that they didn't do the drive the way they wanted it to or weren't as successful. And so this is a letter from the Youth Council to the adult branch saying, like, we did it. We have this list of 800 people that's registered, and if you're complaining about it, we'd like to hear that directly from. So it gives you a sense of this tension that's developing between young people and elders in the community around activism. There are all kinds of cool things like this. We're in a smoking era during this time period. So in the collection, there's a number of match packs that. This one's printed in Zanesville, but the Congress of Racial Equality and other organizations would have them printed or have them sent in and distribute them. So this is a favorite of mine, the Nebraska Clothing Company. So you opened up to strike the match, and it says, "We believe in tolerance and fellowship." Here's the outside of it. Americans ask, is he a good worker? Not what's his race or religion. So again, this kind of universalistic post-war efforts to say we're all Americans, we have to bridge these differences of race and religion and things like that. Omaha is also linked to other national moments. So this is a flyer that you would see in a number of American cities trying to organize local people in that place, so here Omaha, to go and participate in the 1963 March on Washington. This is a receipt for a poll tax from the South, so artifacts from the Southern movement that people who came south and through their experience have in their possession that made their way into the collection, right? So black people in Omaha are largely rooted in the South, so they bring that experience of Jim Crow South with them into this northern context. A flyer to commemorate the killing of Medgar Evers, the Mississippi leader who was assassinated in 1963. So again, here's A. Philip Randolph, great African-American labor leader and organizer of the March on Washington, who comes to Omaha to give a talk. Here's Mildred Brown and Hubert Humphrey. Later in the 1980s, here's Harold Washington, who's the first black mayor in Chicago, who was elected in 1985, comes and talks in Omaha. So Omaha, again, is connected to the broader national politic around race. Here's Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz, coming in the 1980s when the birth site of Malcolm X was recognized. Here is a letter from Senator Hruska here in the state around lobbying for the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and his response to that. He holds out to try to water down federal power and ultimately supports it. The site of high school sports is a place and a site of great racial tension in the 1960s. Think about it. It's still like this today. We had an incident with the Omaha South and Lincoln East, I think it was, a few years ago in the soccer championship, where primarily white, affluent, middle-class kids from Lincoln East threw green cards on the field at the South Omaha students who were playing in the soccer championship, right? Lived very separately, living in a time of tension over immigration and things like that. Same here. Racial change is happening, transformation is happening, but white and black people largely live separately. But through the state championships, and particularly in basketball and football, there's a number of conflicts that happen at those championships where oftentimes it's a white school against a black school. And so at this one, this is the last time that the basketball championship was in Omaha. Tech is playing again, I forget, it's again like Lincoln East or something, white school from Lincoln, black school from Omaha. All kinds of racist stuff you can hear and are reported from the white parents beforehand. This is where they're going to make their stand. You know, we've kind of let black people into our work and at school, but we're not going to let them. They're lobbying the refs. The refs heard to say we're going to foul out their best players in the first half, which they do. Tech gets upset. They're seen as the clear favorite. They lose the championship afterwards. White parents and others reportedly block the exits, not letting black people out. A melee happens. Police are called, and the police come and arrest African-Americans and beat African-American young people, resulting in a lot of injuries. And so this is a community flyer about this incident. So here's a kid who's been injured. You know, like this police did this stuff. Broken arm. So lots of, tension around athletic championships as the society is trying to renegotiate this racial change that's happening. I'm going to kind of go forward here. I just want to point this out. Urban Action Association organizes during this 1970s period around police-community relations. There's nothing new about tensions around police-community relations. And as we move forward in time, in the late 60s and the 70s, we move into the Black Power era, an era where African Americans engage in more militant activism, often in racially exclusive ways, so wanting to build up black community institutions, less interested in interracialism, often more willing to engage in more militant activism, armed self-defense maybe even, etc., heightened rhetoric. So here's Ernie Chambers, who comes of age during this period, ultimately will win election to the legislature and still going strong today, right? Lots of buttons from national campaigns, both the George Wallace campaign, which was popular in a reactionary way among many whites in Omaha during this period, and then later in the 80s, the Jesse Jackson campaign of 84 and 88 was a real rallying point for civil rights advocates during that period. Of course, Malcolm X was born in Omaha. Here's a copy of his birth certificate in the collection. He doesn't live here very long, but one of the most significant civil rights and racial justice leaders in all of history, and an international symbol of freedom. Have organizations like this. We can see the Black Power influence, right? Free Your Mind, but again, a grassroots kind of local newsletter kind of a piece here. A lot of kind of culture and arts festival type stuff that's happening both on the UNO campus and in the community, commemorating Malcolm X. Still have Malcolm X festival there, but black arts, right? So race pride, race consciousness, recovering black history, African history, etc. Here's a local paper as well. From the organization that leads the Black Liberators for Action on Campus. These folks would ultimately lead a sit-in on campus, get arrested at UNO, and that would lead to the establishment of the Black Studies program on campus. But you can, they're really pointing out in a much more pointed way discriminatory mechanisms and institutions in the community. We can see a different kind of tenor here, right? To be black and conscious in America is to be in a state of rage and anger. Poetry, soul music. Here's Melvin Wade, who along with his wife came from California to be the first chair of the UNO Black Studies Department. This is his faculty picture, which is great, right? He's got his very black power, right? His hair is natural. He's got his shades on. I've had to build this. So, it's a controversial thing and a lot of opposition to Black Studies, and I'm in the Black Studies program here, the African-American Studies program. Same deal, it took protest and compelling the institution to establish this. Same with women's studies, Latino studies, etc. But you get a sense from these Black Power artifacts, again, the different tenor of the movement at the time, by the time we get to the late 1960s. Eldridge Cleaver is brought as a speaker, connected with the Black Panther Party nationally, and it's controversial. So here you've got some folks at St. Paul United Methodist saying, I'm not a big fan of Eldridge Cleaver, and he's like a little too radical, and right. So it creates discussion within the community about tactics and strategy and militancy and radicalism and what it's really going to take to make change. One of the most significant issues is the case of Ed Poindexter and David Rice, later Mondo Wilonga, two Black Panthers in Omaha who are put in prison in 1970 for a bombing that happens, pretty spurious charges. Here we have an FBI document that talks about suppressing evidence in the case because they're afraid that it will help them get out. Mondo has died in prison. Ed is still in prison. So there's a lot of documents and things around that. David Rice Mondo Wilonga is a poet, and so he publishes poetry, and so here's some poetry of his about being in prison in the 1970s. Right, he does a lot of work with young people in the prison. The Nebraskans for Justice is an organization that continues to go today to work to advocate for Ed and Mondo. They're considered by Amnesty International political prisoners, and if you consider them political prisoners, they are the longest serving political prisoners in the United States today. So a lot of community work around not only the Black Panther work, but then trying to get these two Black Panthers out. And then as we move on in time, so here's a flyer in 1990, still working on that case. Right. Here's a affirmative action case in 1977 charging KETV with discrimination in employment. Again, by the 1980s, still kind of Black consciousness work. So I'm just showing you these to say this is not just the 60s and 70s, that this work continues on. Community newsletter, there's Ernie at the center there. Angela Davis, radical figure, who's come to Omaha and Lincoln several times to advocate for Ed and Mondo in their case. Continuing efforts to, what does it mean to live in a post-civil rights society? If you want to live black and white together, what does it mean to do that coming out of our history where we haven't done that? And so organizations trying to get people together to talk and share. Efforts to highlight Black progress. Blacks in music, significant Blacks in newspaper, business, and literature. Anti-apartheid activism, etc. So there's a really rich history here that stretches before the Civil Rights era all the way up to the 1990s, really, in the collection. So I just really wanted to share some of that to give you a sense that there's a there right here in Omaha, that these struggles were here and are here and continue to be here, and that we have a rich history that's worth understanding and knowing about, and that might help us a little bit more to understand our own community and think about where to go from here. I think we're at our time. Right? Thank you.